We'll just take a few minutes to make sure that everybody has joined the webinar. Thank you all very much for coming.
Thank you.
Welcome to everybody that's joining the webinar. We're just waiting a few moments to make sure that everybody's here that registered. Thank you. So I think we'll make a start because it's 1 minute past 2 and we've got a lot of papers to get through. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this meeting to discuss ZeFKo's special issue on feminist and gender approaches to disarmament. My name is Henrietta Wilson. I'm really pleased to be here with you all and delighted to have had the chance to be part of the editorial team that put this special issue together alongside Nancy Ehrenberg-Peters, give a wave, Nancy, and Yanis Kappelman, give a wave, Yanis, both of whom started off as master's students in London way back at the start of this project, and now Nance works as a Beirut-based research analyst and writer, and Yanis is a PhD candidate at the University of Hamburg. So it's great to be with you. Our other person on our editorial team was Professor Dan Plesch from SOAS, and the director of the Scrap Weapons Project, which we'll be saying a bit more about in a bit. So thank you to them, thank you to ZeFKo, but also want to put front and centre a massive thank you to Eloisa Romani and Zara Kapasi, who have really done a lot of work putting this event together and basically underpin everything that Scrap does. So thank you very much. So what we're doing today is we're talking about a special issue of the German academic journal ZeFKo, which is on studies on peace and conflict. Our special issue comprises 8 new papers, together with an introduction by the editors and a foreword from Carol Cohn, author of the 1987 foundational paper, Sex and Death in the Age of, I'm sorry, I've got the title wrong, in Defence Intellectuals. Thank you very much. So most of these papers are now available on the internet, and we'll post a link to that in the chat. The issue as a whole will be coming out very, very soon, together with our introduction. So what you can expect from today, the first chunk of time is going to be some commentary, some overviews about this special issue as a whole and how we put it together. So we're going to be hearing from Nance and Dan and Charlotte shortly. And then we're going to dedicate the rest of the session to hearing presentations about 5 of the papers. Unfortunately, not all 8 papers could be represented today because the authors weren't available, but I'll be mentioning them all later. For the people that are attending, I just want to point out this is being recorded, and the recording will be on the Scrap website after this event. Also, please feel free to raise any questions or comments in the chat function throughout the webinar. Yanis and I will be fielding them and we'll be putting them to the individual authors or co-authors at the end of their presentations. And there'll also be time for a broader conversation at the end before Yanis wraps up. So now, to start off with, Nance is going to present the foundations, the thinking behind the special issue and how we did it all. Thank you very much, Nance.
Thank you, Henrietta, and I would like to just first echo your warm words of welcome to everyone, and especially a huge thank you to all the contributors here and those who couldn't be present with us today. This launch event of the special issue marks a milestone, and it's an important achievement and development in academia and in the fields of peace, conflict, and international relations. For those of you who don't know, Scrap Weapons began the Feminist Leadership in Disarmament project in September 2021. Our student team of emerging voices organised 7 webinars showcasing 20 expert practitioners, policymakers, and academics from a wide and diverse range of disarmament, peace and conflict, and arms control organisations, most of whom were women from the Global South. The webinars were well regarded because of their novel substance and representation, aiming to raise awareness of the achievements of women in disarmament and to provide an understanding of the critical role of women and feminist perspectives for sustainable peace. We also addressed the financial, structural, and geographically defined challenges facing women seeking to enter and work within the field, and we provided solutions to such. The panelists interrogated issues such as the representation of women in the disarmament, arms control, and peace-building fields, strategies and logics of feminist activism, the role and practice of gender within United Nations processes, and regional questions within Latin America and the Caribbean, South Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and the global North. By examining the cases of global disarmament, arms control, and non-proliferation, we believe that we were able to provide an understanding both of the role of women and the manifestations of patriarchal structures within international security and peace endeavours. So building on this amazing project that took place, the team made a successful proposal to ZeFKo Journal in Peace and Conflict Studies. And we have collectively been working on producing a special issue, providing in-depth empirical, theoretical, and intersectional analyses of the role of gender in peace, conflict, and disarmament. The concept of gender is important because it goes beyond traditional male-female binaries and considers both women's leadership and patriarchal structures as important influences. By ensuring that men and masculinity are also considered, and by incorporating intersectional analyses, we can enhance our understanding of what violence is, where power is concentrating, and how to devise solutions to overcome systemic manifestations. Historically, as we all know, foreign policy and international security have been dominated by the male elite and the global North, and they've been upheld and defined by patriarchal and masculine structures, power, and language. Consequently, this has meant the voices of women in diplomatic efforts for disarmament and peace building and everything in between have been largely marginalized and disregarded. So examining the cases of global disarmament, arms control, and non-proliferation, the special issue papers firstly explore the role of women and the manifestations of patriarchal structures in international security and peace. Secondly, the special issue challenges racism and white supremacy in nuclear policies through ensuring that underrepresented voices and experiences are heard in an important academic journal. And thirdly, it directly addresses race and discrimination against ethnic minority groups in the disarmament field. And just to finish off, while I think we can all be extremely proud of how the special issue addresses some of these issues, it also reflects how much further the international and academic communities have in terms of bringing about sustainable progress in advancing genuine representation of feminist and underrepresented perspectives and ultimately aiming to overcome systemic barriers. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the webinar.
Thank you, Nance, and fantastic job of condensing a lot of hard work, a lot of thinking, a lot of ideas into a good chunk of time. I'm now going to invite Dan Plesh to explain the Scrap Weapons Project and how this came to support the production of the special issue. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you very much, Henrietta. Forgive me if I'm a little bit hoarse. I'm nursing a traditional English cold this January. So first of all, I wanted to thank Henrietta and Nance and Yanis, my colleagues, in bringing this whole project together, which I think is very exciting and important, and also, of course, our colleagues in ZeFKo. All the contributions, I think, are outstanding and very rich, and it is, I think, a regret that we weren't able to bring everyone together in London or some other suitable venue for a big party, but sadly our resources don't run to that. But I want to say that we, and I'm sure everybody else here, would be very happy to support any local or global network events that you all are part of in taking the message forward from this from this event, which we see very much as a starting point for the dissemination of the ideas within this special issue, and very much a beginning of the next phase rather than a sign off on or just a sign off on the production of this very important volume. Now, Scrap as a whole is designed to answer the question, perhaps in some ways first prominently posed by the founding meeting of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom in The Hague in 1915, in times of war even far grimmer than those we are experiencing today. And my goodness, they are grim every time we turn on our television sets. But at that point, the 15,000 women who came together in The Hague were seeking, for humanitarian reasons, global controls on what now we laughably call conventional weapons. Tanks just started, aircraft just started, artillery, and so on. Now we have seen, albeit some progress, much of it now put through the shredder by the leading powers, but some progress in controlling weapons. And the Scrap project is really about rediscovering that founding vision and comprehensive approach. And after all, if we can have a comprehensive approach to global industry to tackle climate chaos, then we can certainly should have a global approach to tackling weapons. And within that, it's partly about technologies, it's partly about, and we have some technical studies, it's partly about diplomacy, and we have a rough draft treaty, but it's also about ideas and ideology. And from my point of view, and I hesitate as a bloke to say this, that broadly speaking, as Nance so skillfully outlined, these ideas are central if we are ever to have a soft landing from the current patriarchal, psychotic machismo that we see in so many parts of the world right now, and that these issues perhaps were briefly central to state views of international security at the time of the founding of the UN, but have been stupidly pushed aside. And you all, I would say, I think, have done a phenomenal job in helping re-energize that agenda. And we look forward to working with you in various fora, but not least in the UN, where perhaps against all odds, there is to be a summit for the future, certainly not a summit for the past, a summit for the future at the end of this year. And part of that, we hope, with a growing group of non-governmental and governmental groups, to have another special session of the General Assembly lasting some weeks to re-energize the disarmament agenda. And as part of that, of course, the feminist agenda has to be front and center. So that's what we are about as a project, how we see this fitting in, but not least also the opportunity to give space for voices that may not otherwise have space to come forward and to use our, let us say, our power as SOAS at the University of London to help share that power with you all. And also, speaking from my own decades-long experience, the idea that one has to wait to do your bachelor's, do your master's, do your PhD, get a post, then you might possibly be heard, is, I think, bad for individuals, bad for society, and bad for the world. So I think the people speaking today, who are originally our students, show that this hierarchy is a nonsense, and a nonsense that gets in the way of advancing thinking and policy. So my hat's off to the student participants. And also I have to say a special word to Henrietta, who I think has used her huge experience to help overcome and navigate some of the issues that inexperience doesn't equip you for. And if I played a small role, dare I say, as midwife of the process, then I'm very happy to have done so. So with that, I'll hand back to Henrietta, and I'll now shut up.
Dan, thank you very much for those warm words. And also, thank you for setting out the rationale behind SCRAP, this really interesting and useful, important project combining action with understanding. And I want to invite Charlotte Meyer from ZeFKo to say a few words. Charlotte's now the managing editor of ZeFKo Studies in Peace and Conflict, and also studying for a PhD at the Institute of Political Science. Her research interests span huge amounts of things, as everybody's does: populism, political communication, and social movements. Thank you very much, Charlotte.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction and for having me. As Henrietta said, I'm the managing editor of the ZeFKo, and here speaking on behalf of the editors who unfortunately can't be here today. So on behalf of the editors, I want to express our sincere thanks to the Scrap Weapons team, to all the authors, and to all the reviewers for making this special issue possible. We are thrilled to be able to further expand the ZeFKo internationally with a special issue and with such an innovative and current topic. Feminist approaches to arms control, and disarmament have long come too short in the field of peace and conflict studies. So we are very proud of this special issue, which is an important contribution to the field that offers state-of-the-art conceptual and practical analyses that shed light on a broad range of topics. And we very much hope that these contributions spark further research in this vital area of peace and conflict studies. Thank you again to everyone who made this special issue possible, and to all the organizers for this event to be able to present this special issue in such a format.
Thank you, Charlotte. Really, it's you know, as we mentioned before, it's such an honour to have had the chance to work with you on this. So now we're going to move the webinar towards the presentations from of the particular papers in the special issue. As mentioned, there are several people that couldn't be here together today and with us together. And I'm just going to list that Carol Cohn wrote our foreword. I'm very sorry I got the name of her paper wrong. I tend to just call it Sex and Death. The full title is Sex and Death in the Rational World of Defence Intellectuals, which really has inspired a lot of my work, and I think inspired a lot of this webinar and then special issue approaches. So I'm sorry she couldn't be here with us. Ray Asherson provided a paper on abolition, not arms control, against reinforcing nuclear weapons through reform. Fascinating paper. Shelf Egeland and Hevatala Taha co-authored a paper, Experts, Activists and Girl Bosses of the Nuclear Apocalypse, Feminism's in Security Discourse. And those two papers by Asherson and the second one by Egeland and Tala really were an interesting response to people who think feminist approaches can be a single-handed solution, in that they point out that sometimes feminist approaches actually reinforce the status quo rather than transforming it. And finally, the third paper that isn't represented today is by Jessica West, which is called Lost in Space, Feminist Considerations of Space Security. Again, a really kind of current, topical issue that would benefit from more consideration, and Jessica gets that going. So a quick reminder, please post your questions or comments in the chat, and I will now introduce our first paper, which is by Laura Considine. Laura is a lecturer in international relations at the University of Leeds, where she's also co-director of the Centre for Global Security Challenges. She's got immense experience and expertise in nuclear weapons and international processes relating to those, feminist approaches, nuclear disarmament, and she's got a huge publication experience in Millennium, the Journal of International Studies, International Affairs. I could go on. But Laura, much more interested to hear from you. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you very much for organising this. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. And yeah, thank you for all of the work that you've put into bringing all of us together and putting together this special issue. Yeah, my paper in this issue is related to research that I have been doing on narrative and nuclear weapons, and particularly the story of the nuclear origin myth. So the story that's told, I think that's become what's kind of called common sense about the Manhattan Project and the beginning of the nuclear age. I've been, doing work on why I think it's really important to interrogate this and to think about the power of these stories that we tell in various different forms about the beginning of the nuclear age. And this is a story that has it's a highly kind of westernized US story. It's a story of progress, scientific progress and development. And it's a story of often what's understood through kind of the tropes of male genius. And we see this, I wrote the article before the recent Oppenheimer film came out, but we can, this is all kind of very much brought to the fore by this film. And I think that this matters today, not just in terms of, a representation of the past, but in terms of the kind of political importance and the socio-political implications of how we understand the nuclear past and what it means for thinking about our nuclear present and our nuclear future. So how do those stories that are told over and over again in popular culture and in academia and in our teaching, how do they impact on what we can conceive of as possible for nuclear politics? So I've been working on this, and one of the things that came up, that's very clear, is that that the story of tragic male genius, and just quite how gendered this story of the Manhattan Project is in all sorts of ways. And so my piece, which is quite short, really just wants to start a conversation and ask a question of, how might we tell feminist stories about nuclear beginnings? What would that entail, and what would that challenge? And, this is not in any way a complete or even partially complete overview, but just a kind of a set of reflections and some pathways that I thought might be opened up through thinking about telling feminist stories about the nuclear past. And I think that, I think we are living in difficult times, and times where it's difficult to even be in the world and see what's going on and being legitimized. But I think there is hope in terms of the incredible scholars and activists that are really kind of taking on these issues and starting to expand and challenge the kind of the dominant narratives that have been in place. And kind of taking on a whole legacy of feminist scholars who have been doing this. So I just made a couple of suggestions in my article about what are different ways in which we might think about telling feminist stories about the nuclear beginning. So the first one is that the question of where are the women? So, this is a story of men and of the tragic decisions that kind of elite men have had to make, the story of the Manhattan Project. There is some work that has been done on women in the Manhattan Project, but certainly, even if you look to go back to the recent Oppenheimer film, this is a story about a very specific and small group of individuals. So that's obviously one thing, that we can think about, but certainly simply just asking the question of representation is never going to be enough to tell feminist stories. So the second, way in which we can think about it is to, engage with feminist ability to allow us to look at marginalized bodies and places. So, how can we think about the stories that haven't been told about nuclear history, and whose stories haven't been told? So in terms of the Manhattan Project, the stories that are told are about a small group of elite scientists, but there was over 100,000 people who were employed in the Manhattan Project, and a lot of these were, as janitors or machinists or cleaners, and some of these people were those who, were originally living on land that was taken for the Manhattan Project, whose land was taken away, such as the homesteaders in Los Alamos in New Mexico, and then returned to Los Alamos as cleaners. And I think an important point to be made is that, so many of the stories focus on the tragic decisions that these elite men had to make. Most of the people who were involved in the Manhattan Project had no choices to make because they worked in ignorance. They weren't told about what they were doing. They didn't have a choice, and they didn't know oftentimes about the dangers of the work that they were doing. So how can we tell those people's stories, or how could we tell a nuclear history that engages with this? And then the third aspect that I thought we can tell kind of more stories, or we can include in our storytelling, is to try and think about the larger narrative within which the story of the Manhattan Project and the beginning of the nuclear age is located. So, we can think about this in terms of a continuum of time, and linking the development of nuclear weapons into a much longer tradition of colonialism, extractivism in the spaces of the development of nuclear weapons. And we can also think about it as in terms of a continuum of space. So, how is the very specific violence of the explosion of a nuclear weapon, how does this link to other forms of harm and other violence that is occurring in different places along the nuclear weapons complex and in the service of the production of nuclear weapons? So thinking about the continuum of violence within which that kind of moment of nuclear explosion and that extremism of the nuclear explosion takes place, and how relocating that within different sets of contexts and different timelines might tell a very, very different story to the current story that we're told. So, I mean, yeah, that's kind of what I've the kind of intent of the piece was to try and think about how expanding the dominant understanding of the nuclear past might actually open up avenues for different nuclear futures. And so I hope it's just a kind of a prompt or something that could get you thinking about what might be possible. Yeah.
Laura, thank you very, very much. I loved your paper. And when I saw Oppenheimer, I had a huge extra set of knowledge to draw on, and an extra set of kind of criteria to think about when watching the movie. So I'm glad you mentioned it, and I'm glad I read your paper first, if that makes sense. We don't have any questions yet on the chat function, so I'm going to abuse my right and ask you my question. So it's entirely compelling to me, the case that you put out, that histories they overlook, they're inaccurate, they because they miss out, they have profound gaps, and the history of the world's nuclear programs is enormously powerful in collective imaginations, and so what I'm interested is if you have any perspectives. I appreciate yours is a sort of introduction to a conversation that we'd like to keep growing, and I wonder if you see there's an appetite for this in different communities. When the Oppenheimer movie came out, I was aware that there were a burst of articles saying they didn't mention this or they didn't mention these people, which was really refreshing for me. And I wondered, from your perspective, do you see that conversation growing? Do you see that conversation growing amongst people that might be in a position to make a difference? I mean, I guess maybe most pointedly, I mean, I'd like you to reflect generally on that. And the final part of my question might be unanswerable at the moment. Do policymakers show any interest in the sorts of points that that you raise? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to say that the stories that I'm talking about do exist, right? You know, there are people, you know, from the Pacific or from Kazakhstan or from all sorts of different spaces, from New Mexico, where I recently was, who have been telling their stories for a long time, and it's just a question of who's listening to them. And it's the Oppenheimer, I think, is interesting because there was an outburst of, you know, Oppenheimer didn't engage with this, and you know, a critiques of the film based on that. And I partially think that, in a way, I don't think that that's the film's fault, in that, you know, the film has a very specific, you know, it is the sort of film, it's the kind of the tragic great man story from their perspective, and that's just what it does. And as such, it's almost incapable of doing those other things. I think the problem is that these are the only sorts of films that get made about this. So it's a kind of a broader issue about what gets made and what gets seen, rather than, you know, Oppenheimer is never going to be able to say everything about the story because it's so unbelievably complex. But, you know, why is this the only type of film that gets the kind of the attention and gets the money to be made as well? So I think it's about a kind of I guess, political economy of the media in terms of popular culture, you know, in terms of what's seen as because there's people out there telling their stories all the time, but, you know, are we listening to them? But I would say that, you know, certainly, in terms of, you know, policymakers listening, you know, one of I was at the second meeting of states parties of the Treaty of the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and, you know, and that is a space in which, you know, the voices of those who have been impacted by nuclear weapons has been incredibly prominent and is listened to, and there was sessions, you know, on that at the United Nations, and it was, you know, so that's, I think, a place in which this does have purchase. So yeah, I don't know. I think how do we, you know, we don't really need more stories in a way, in you know, in terms of, like, there's people who are ready to tell their story. It's about facilitating that, and how do we get those stories listened to, and how do we get them heard in both kind of, you know, popular culture and in policy spaces. And but I think, actually, in terms of the Humanitarian Initiative and the TPNW, that those stories are being told in policy spaces, certainly for the states who are involved in that process, in a way that is quite heartening, and is, you know, I think, not perfect, because there is also an issue within those spaces of, you know, these are, you know, kind of places in which, like the UN, where in New York, where it's difficult for, you know, civil society from particular countries to get visas, and, you know, there's all sorts of accessibility issues still, but I think it's progress, and I think that it is a bright spot in terms of hearing those stories.
Thank you. That's very heartening, and it also does a great job of segueing into our next talks, actually. Yanis, I think you're going to introduce our next talk, but thank you very much to Laura. Brilliant.
Thank you so much, Laura. And I've seen we have another question, but we take this at the end of this session. And indeed, Henrietta, I think Laura's thoughts about you know, knowledge and about stories being told draws very much together with Catherine Ashley's ideas that she's going to talk about in a minute on transoceanic solidarity. We have to think about the Pacific as well, I think, in that regard. So Catherine Ashley's title, or Catherine Ashley's paper, is entitled "Why Haven't You Known Transoceanic Solidarity and the Politics of Knowledge in Feminist Anti-Nuclear Activism?" And Catherine is an international relations and social movement scholar with an interest in feminist critiques of the global nuclear order. Initially working to extend Western Cold War feminist anti-nuclear arguments to post-Cold War developments, and to interrogate the politics of peace camps in the UK, she's now developing a feminist anti-nuclear research agenda, which takes coloniality more seriously. To that end, she co-coordinates the international interdisciplinary and femnukes research networks, which recently produced a special section in international affairs, which we are very happy about as well, which is kind of, an amazing project as well, which I encourage everyone to read the papers of in the international affairs special section. She has also recently published the collection of feminism and the protest camps, critique, entanglements, and reimaginings. Catherine, take it away.
Thank you, Yanis, and thank you to your colleagues as well for all your hard work on this special issue and for inviting us along today. I'm delighted to be here with you and with such wonderful co-authors, and to be following on from Laura's talk about her very inspiring reflection. My piece too, as you've pointed out, Yanis, there is a resonance between Laura's paper and mine, in that I think you could see this paper as focusing on nuclear stories that haven't been widely heard. So in my paper focuses on a historical case of feminist anti-nuclear activism from the 80s and 90s. I'm particularly interested in a dimension of that activism that's not widely known today, which is the solidarity politics that reached across oceans to connect UK-based feminist peace activists and Indigenous activists in the Pacific in a shared struggle against nuclear colonialism. And more specifically, the article is a study of how solidarity is constructed in the archive of the British-based network Women Working for a Nuclear-Free and Independent Pacific, or the WWNFIP. This network emerged from Greenham Common Women's Peace Camp in 1984, and it quickly developed the aim of raising awareness of nuclear colonialism in the Pacific among the wider British peace movement. And it invited several Indigenous women on speaking tours of the UK, and I'm going to name a few of those. So in 1985, Titivai Haravira from Aotearoa, New Zealand, came to the UK along with Shalang Palacios from the Northern Marianas, and later the same year, Maria Pangilinan and Jacoba Saman from the Northern Marianas came as well. The network then hosted Lorenza Pedro from Palau and Lijon Eknalang from Rongelap in 1986, and Isabella Sumang and Sita Morai from Palau in 1996. And there were other women as well in between. As well as these tours, the network published pamphlets, including one entitled Pacific Women Speak, Why Haven't You Known?, which echoes a speech by Titivai Haravira to British audiences, and from which my article also gains its title. And the network also published a regular newsletter that gave a platform to Pacific issues and voices between 1984 and 2000. So there's a lot of newsletters, there's over 40 in the archive that I've found. So I stumbled across an archive of these documents, really almost by chance, at Glasgow Women's Library near where I live several years ago. And I think it's an important collection in part because it's a challenge, however small, to the erasure of Indigenous women from feminist and peace archives, given the platform it gives to the words and self-representations of women from the Pacific region. However, I want to stress that the documents aren't really a co-creation, in that the words of the Indigenous activists are selected, transcribed, edited by the British-based counterparts, and they come to us through that filter, so that needs to be borne in mind. I'm continuing to work with Glasgow Women's Library at the moment to catalogue and digitise this archive to try and make it more widely available, and to expand it with some oral history interviews from those involved. But for this ZeFKo paper, I focus purely on the texts, on the documents. And in line with current feminist methodological approaches, I recognise that I'm actively participating in the construction of this archive. I'm trying to treat it as a site to reinterpret the present as well as the past, very much in line with what Laura was just saying. And I also try to be particularly attentive in my analysis to its ambiguities and ambivalences. But in brief, my empirical arguments in the paper are threefold. So first, the WWNFIP documents elevate Indigenous women from across the Pacific region as experts, knowers, and teachers, with British-based women represented as following their lead. Second, and closely connected, the documents foreground Indigenous diagnoses of the nuclear condition in terms of nuclear colonialism, and they correspondingly insist that decolonization is essential to nuclear abolition. So in other words, the Pacific women set the parameters of this political project in which both sides of the solidarity relationship are involved. They diagnose the problem and they set the solution. And third, the documents represent these solidarity relationships in terms not only of sisterly closeness between women working for a shared goal in different locations, but also as requiring the discomfort of white Western audiences with challenges to what we would now call white ignorance, white fragility, colonial unknowing. And this discomfort is intended directed towards white British audiences to try and provoke action. So what's the implications of these specific empirical arguments about the women working for nuclear free and independent Pacific? Well, I think this case has wider implications for how we think about solidarity in the first place, because of its emphasis on the role of Indigenous knowledge in constructing a collective struggle against the global nuclear order. It effectively shows how epistemological community is the basis of a shared political project. And very tentatively, I suggest that this may be relevant to understanding the mechanics of more recent anti-nuclear solidarities, particularly ICANN and the successful campaign for the TPNW that Laura mentioned earlier. But in more length in my conclusions, I reflect on the implications for scholarship on feminist anti-nuclear activism more generally. And in this spirit, I redirect Haravira's question, why haven't you known, to the readers of the article, and by extension to our audience here today. So I imagine my readers and this audience, and perhaps this is wrong, but as broadly feminist and anti-nuclear in their sympathies and interests, but as not having heard before of the WWNFIP or of the Pacific women's stories that it documents. And I too was ignorant of the former, if not entirely of the latter, before I went along to this archive open day at the Glasgow Women's Library. So Haravira's question urges us to consider why we might not know about this network. And I suggest that the dominant stories we tell about feminism and about peace activism are functioning to actively obscure anti-racist and anti-colonial work of the kind pursued by the WWNFIP, as well as contributing to the marginalization of Indigenous voices. And what I'm trying to do with this paper is bring the women working for nuclear free and independent Pacific back into view as an instructive resource for contemporary scholars and advocates of feminist disarmament. And given the ongoing impacts of nuclear testing in the Pacific, even today, the solidarity building that was undertaken in the 80s and 90s remains an urgent task for us as well. So I end with the question, why haven't you known? And just try and allow that to resonate with the readers of the piece and of the audience here today. So thanks very much, everyone. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Catherine, for the very impressive and important work that you've done and presentation that you gave us to reflect about where knowledge comes from and whose knowledge counts. Thank you also to Lyndon Muford, who has put another resource on that in the chat. If there's no Q&A, I don't see question in the Q&A, so I also would like to take the liberty, Catherine, to ask a question, if I may. So you've touched a bit on that already, but I'm really interested on what can be done to elevate marginalized voices and knowledge that has been ignored or oppressed. So what are the best practices on that from your side? And Dan has probably a question or comment as well.
Shall we take Dan's question too?
I think it's good to collect them, yes.
Well, I was around when the first tour came to England from the Pacific, and had the pleasure and honor to meet the individuals that you mentioned. Their impact was very considerable, and I'm not sure if you're in the paper, but the fact that we have a pretty much observed global ban on exploding nuclear weapons to kind of show that the male member works. That ban came about in the 90s, and this movement that you're writing about had a very important part to play in that international agreement, in creating public opinion, in the networks and so on. There was very important to impacting one of the major achievements of disarmament across the whole international security field. So I think that's a very, very important role that the movement that you described had. And when we think about marginal movements, I would say this wasn't a marginal, this was a central component of getting to the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty.
Thanks very much. Shall I come back in on those 2 points now? So, I mean, they're very, very thought-provoking questions and require a longer answer than I'm going to be able to give here. But first, in terms of yours, Yanis, if I've understood you correctly, are you asking me in best practice in terms of archiving, or best practice in ensuring that Indigenous peoples are central to coalitions in here and now?
My question was to the latter, but I mean, I'm interested in archiving as well. So
yeah, I'm not the best person to answer towards the second. I think it's a really, really important, pressing, continuing political challenge. And I guess that's what one of the things at Contemporary Resonances I was trying to draw out in the paper, that this question is not a sort of done with, that we still need to pay attention to it and to think about why the mechanisms through which certain voices, constituencies, and those most affected by the global nuclear order are those often least heard, particularly in the centers of power. And there's no easy solution to this. It's that we're not just talking structures of knowledge, we're also talking, the mechanisms of representation, the international system, the institutional mechanisms at every level. I think they will reinforce the dominance of certain voices over others. In particular, it's very hard anyway to trouble the status quo in terms of nuclear policy, let alone to foreground the voices of those most affected. However, as Laura has mentioned in her response, it is happening, it is possible, it is having impact. We know that from the TPNW itself, where one of the questions I try and explore very briefly in the paper is that, perhaps it's the way in which I can brought in Indigenous voices as knowledge leaders and experts, and the way in which it also importantly foregrounded the testimonial form as being so as finally ensuring that some of these voices had more impact and were able to bring them into international negotiations as more equal partners. But I think it's an ongoing struggle, and I think we have to really learn from Indigenous activists themselves about what they need and what they require from white Western audiences, and there's plenty of people writing and talking about that, and we need to be more attentive to that. So that, I'm not the person that needs to give you those answers. We need to get those answers from elsewhere. In terms of Dan's point, that's really interesting to hear, Dan, that you saw some of the tours in the 80s of the speakers that were hosted by WNFIP. I mean, I myself actually first learned of the network. I didn't know it was the WWNFIP network then, but I was at a meeting in Scotland of Scottish CND, and we were talking about the Pacific, and someone started to talk about the impact on them from seeing in the 80s and how this had shaped their entire activism of seeing some of these women talk at events in Scotland. So I thought, my goodness, that's really interesting. What's that he's talking about, and who is he talking about? And then I've kind of figured out that it's this network bringing these women over. Certainly hundreds of people, particularly those already involved in the British peace movement, would have seen these women from the Pacific speak in the UK. And so anecdotally, I think it's clear that it was had a profound influence on many people. However, as we all know, it's really, really difficult to chart the impact of social movement activism, and disarmament activism is no exception. It's very difficult to try and track this empirically in the way that, you know, political scientists want us to do. Often the impact is much more diffuse. It's about cultural shifts, you know, it's about ideological shifts, and personal changes, which can be hard to document. And when I've asked that question, so I'm doing interviews now with women who are involved, many of them actually downplay the impact. They're very hesitant to think that their work here had a lot of had particular impact on the test ban treaty, for example. So there is a hesitancy to try and take credit for that. They're quite not more emphasize more the personal change rather than the political change. But they also do all point to the impact of the wider NFIP movement in the Pacific and beyond, and how important that was. So yes, I think they've recontextualized their efforts in that wider NFIP movement that began in Fiji in 1975, and do attribute to that a kind of a very important influence over anti-nuclear debates in the decades that followed. So I'll stop there.
Might I come back very briefly?
Dan, it's going to have to be very quick because we're slightly overrunning, but of course, yes.
If you put the question the other way around, I think the answer becomes crystal clear. If you ask, where was the agency that created the comprehensive nuclear test ban, and can you conceive that agency not including these movements? I think it's inconceivable that the test ban would have come about without these movements and political pressure, of which this particular tour was part. So I hope that's brief enough. I think it's incontestable when you look at it from the perspective of agency.
Well, I think that's really interesting. And Catherine, I'm going to put a note about that, and hopefully we'll be able to pick up on it in the broader Q&As later. But it leads us very nicely to the third presentation, which is by, it was a paper co-authored by Her Excellency Ambassador Maritza Chan and Eloisa Romani. Ambassador Chan is a Costa Rican career diplomat, activist, and expert in this area. She's been the permanent representative of Costa Rica to the UN since 2022 and is the first Costa Rican woman to occupy this role. She's got loads, more than 2 decades of professional experience working at the very highest political levels, and is an expert on international peace and security and the women, peace and security agenda. Eloisa Romani is our Scrap Weapons Project Coordinator. She's also a PhD candidate and associate tutor at SOAS. And before this, she worked for the Vatican, both in the Dicastery of Communications and the COVID-19 Security Task Force. So thank you both very much. Really eager to hear about your work, which really resonates with some of these themes that have already come up about representation, the mechanics of policy making, who's overlooked, who gets to tell the story. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Henrietta, and to all of you for being here today. It's the beginning of the year, and I couldn't think of a better way to start this year than with you and with Louisa and all of the people that share the interest in researching and analyzing processes that have taken place at the UN, and the struggles that we face in making sure that feminism, intersectionality are included in processes, because marrying theory and practice is not that easy. Let me start by stating that our research set out to evaluate the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons against feminist international relations theory and related intersectional and post-colonial critiques. Our aim was to provide an analysis of how the voices of women, as well as other marginalized communities, can be more effectively taken into account in the negotiation processes of nuclear matters at the UN. As we all know, the TPNW is the first gender-sensitive international nuclear weapons agreement into existence. There are 3 mentions of these. The first 2 are in the preamble, and then on Article 6.1 that is related to victim assistance and environmental remediation. These mentions are about the disproportionately effects of the deployment of nuclear weapons on women and girls, and the importance of promoting women's participation in nuclear disarmament mechanisms. We noted that these advances are in part the result of several normative shifts that have happened during the last 2.5 decades, mostly when it comes to human security and the resolutions 1325 on women, peace and security, and resolution 65/69 on women, disarmament, arms control, and non-proliferation. However, we argue that these political fissures are not enough to remedy the reality of the lack of adequate representation of women and marginalized groups' voices in nuclear disarmament. Let me start now by describing our research. Our research analyzed the process that led to the TPNW drafting and negotiation. We examined the statements made by the delegations that participated and the extent to which their voices were heard and their concerns incorporated into the treaty's final text. We noted fundamental contribution of CSOs in driving the humanitarian and gender agenda forward. These include ICAN, the Women International League for Peace and Freedom's Reaching Critical Will program, and the RCRC. From our analysis, it emerged that the main proponents of the gender-specific elements of the treaty were the delegations of Ireland, Liechtenstein, and Sweden. In the case of Sweden, let me point out that the delegation was led by a woman, and she made a concrete proposal to incorporate Resolution 1325, which was strongly rejected by delegations. Most of them led by men. Another Swedish proposal was to include a phrase highlighting the role of women in conflict prevention, which was also rejected. And that proposal was replaced with mentions about promoting the participation, only the participation of women in nuclear disarmament. This detail is crucial to our research because it reflects the liberal feminist assumption that the mere inclusion of women's participation in peace processes is enough to address women's needs, wants, or interests. Whereas in reality, it is important that women take an active role in conflict prevention, as they are disproportionately affected by all conflicts, be it nuclear, conventional weapons, small arms, ammunition, landmines, cluster munitions. Everything has a disproportionate effect on women. And our point is that nuclear weapons are not gender blind. And although the detonation of one or more nuclear weapons reaps mass death and injury, women and girls are at a much higher risk of developing cancer than men and boys. They are the ones who give birth to children with drastic malformations. They are the ones who traditionally look after the ones with disability and injuries. They are the ones who suffer from more reproductive stigmas and are the ones that will be labeled unmarriable as a result, which in many parts of the world would have socioeconomic consequences. So I will leave this here now and I give back the floor to my dear Eloisa. Eloisa, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Chan. So I will carry on by explaining the main argument that we put forward, which is that an adequate inclusion of some female voices and perspective in UN negotiation processes, such as that of the TPNW, needs to significantly address three fundamental structural problems that are entrenched in the patriarchal international nuclear security order, and which are the object of feminist critique in international relations. The first problem, I will say, is cultural and relates to the misogyny of militarism, which is entrenched into the doctrines of deterrence and strategic stability that traditionally belong to elitist circles of predominantly male policymakers. In feminist international relations theory, the dominant realist approach of deterrence informing international relations is a product of the complex and deep-seated association between patriarchy, nuclearism, and militarism. The second structural problem in the nuclear security order is the chronic underrepresentation of women. Here we challenge liberal understandings of feminism that reduce the question of women's emancipation to a matter of tokenism measured in the number of seats at the table. This critique is preoccupied with women who have broken through the glass ceiling in the UN and foreign policy circles, not challenging militarism and its functioning as a driving force of the securitization discourse. Hence, the main concern should not just be the inclusion of women in negotiations, but rather the inclusion of gender-sensitive women and men who are aware of the gender impact of weapons and who aim to pursue an agenda of denuclearization and demilitarization. Then the third structural problem in the nuclear order we identified is more intersectional and post-colonial and refers to the relation of patriarchal systems of oppressions with colonialist and racist practices, such as those that have caused damage to the environment and to the bodies of peoples living in the areas where nuclear tests and uranium mining were conducted. So in consideration of the above, we suggest that gender-sensitive policies cannot and should not be limited to the context of nuclear disarmament, because the lived experiences of women and marginalized communities in conflict zones around the world are affected by the production, trade, and supply of arms that do not fall into the nuclear category, such as small arms and light weapons, landmines, munitions, tanks, and so on. And these are the types of arms mostly used to perpetrate violence against women and people with different gender identities, as well as different ethnic and religious minorities in societies with conflict situations. Another example, non-nuclear weaponry that should be considered if we want to acknowledge the disproportionate effect of militarization on women as opposed to men is landmines. This weaponry itself does not explicitly target women more than men. However, women face higher exposure risks because socially they often are the gatherers of food. And in many fields there are landmines can be found, so they're actually more targeted. Another social factor affecting women is the burden of caregiving for the injured. This can upend female participation in the community and society. Furthermore, girls in conflict areas are often kidnapped to be used as child soldiers and are then forced into servitude by their male counterparts. And despite the known prevalence of such practices, girl soldiers' lack of physical armaments implies that they are not offered the same programs for recovery that are made available to boy soldiers. In sum, it is the unaccounted realities and the untold stories of women and girls, victims of conflicts, mostly geographically situated in the global south, that should be raised to mainstream attention in the disarmament discourse. So in conclusion, we may say that much progress still needs to be made to give justice to the voices of women, as well as those, the voices of the have-nots, basically. The objective is not just widening the representation of women in the nuclear order, but to effectively advance their interests. And this requires incorporating disarmament at the heart of foreign policy and striving to eliminate weapons, which in fact serve the purposes of perpetuating and reproducing patriarchal systems of oppressions, of which women and vulnerable groups are the main victims. And it is for this reason that we suggest that the international disarmament community should embrace a general complete disarmament agenda and request the UN to consider activating a first special session on disarmament, the General Assembly, in the near future. And I would also like to conclude by saying that as ZeFKo, we believe that a special session on disarmament will significantly facilitate furthering discussion about issues that have often been sidelined, such as issues of gender equality, inclusion of voices of women, and any marginalized communities. So thank you for the attention.
Thank you, Eloisa. Thank you, Ambassador Chan. Absolutely fascinating insights and analysis. I think it really reflects very nicely on what Dr. Considine and Dr. Ashley picked up on about this. Numbers aren't enough. You need to think about who's telling the stories, where the overlooked values, where the overlooked views are. So we are running a bit short of time, but I do have a question, a follow-up question for you, if you would consider it. I wonder what I very much heard your conclusion, that care needs to be taken about who's being heard and think beyond the simple numerical bodies in seats in negotiations. And I wondered if you have any thoughts about the practical implications about how this might happen, how we could help with this. Does it look perhaps like diplomats need better training, better support, better information? Does it mean that the mechanisms for international negotiations need changing? It feels to me as though the extent to which talks and negotiations happen in formal or informal settings can greatly change the way people talk about different issues and the way they understand and frame different issues. And I know I'm asking too big of a question, but I couldn't help thinking. So I wonder how much the experiences from the TPNW could apply to other treaty formats, or if they're really restricted to that. Ambassador Chan, yes, please come in.
What a wonderful question, Henrietta. And this is something that I've been highlighting in my first committee statements. We have the TPNW, and we consider the first, gender-sensitive treaty that there is. Nevertheless, when it comes to the TPNW and the NPT negotiations, only 1/3 of the delegates are women. So there is a chronic underrepresentation of women when it comes to disarmament, non-proliferation, and arms control. Another issue is that delegations are not, there is resistance from many delegations to include Resolution 1325, or even to accept that they are disproportionately affect consequences for women when it comes to weapons, any kind of weapons. And the way that I have found around this hurdle is to have joint statements. And when you have 64 member states agreeing that we should have disaggregated data by age or sex, or that there should be specific references to certain resolutions, this is when you win. Otherwise, you won't get those references included. There is still a long way to go for delegations to understand and fully comprehend that including women, it goes beyond just stating that women should participate or have a seat at the table. And that brings me to my last point. We must recognize the TPNW as a feminist treaty because it mirrors security with justice and equality and care and human security. But it is, when you say that you have a feminist foreign policy, this is incompatible with nuclear weapons because nuclear weapons are against what we, the environment, people, and we need to raise awareness about this, and reflect the gender bias, insecurity doctrines, and the impacts of nuclear weapons on men, girls, and boys, men and boys. Denuclearization, demilitarization agenda must be pursued through an intersectional approach, and yet we're not there yet. We need to advocate for effective inclusion, but more than that, through a shift in the paradigm in which we understand security. And to be honest, I thought that we got to that point with the pandemic. The pandemic showed us that no one is secure until everybody secure, that the security, our threats cross borders, and a virus did that. But just for the pandemic, military spending was the highest there had been. So we missed an opportunity to truly change our paradigms and understand security in broader terms. And Costa Rica, Japan, and Senegal, we are the presidents of the Group of Friends of Human Security. And yet, even including human security in the Pact of the Future, it's a problem. Not all delegations accept the concept of human security or want to talk about excessive military spending. And that was a conversation we had when we were discussing the new agenda for peace. So if you ask me, in the last year when we had the SDG summit, it was an opportunity to talk about excessive military spending. Nobody wanted to talk about it. It was only a few of us who continued to champion Article 26 of the Charter, who continued to address the need for gender-sensitive approaches and human security. But there's a lot of resistance. Sometimes, however, just making the point is a win. I don't think that it's a lost effort. There will be a day when this is a consensual approach. And my final point is we do need to take a look at consensus as a decision-making, rule, or, the H Lab has a recommendation on changing the majority necessary for adoption of certain instruments, simple majority, double majority, but consensus. We are being, we have a straitjacket that is called consensus, and consensus most of the time is the lowest common denominator. And we are here to advance. We are here to take strikes that are sometimes prevented by the rule of consensus. That's all.
Thank you so much. That's so interesting and slightly depressing about the way things are, but also hopeful about mapping possible futures. So thank you very much for that. Eloisa, if you don't mind, I'm going to move us on because we are getting very tight for time now. But will you note down any responses that you have, and we'll come back to them in the broader Q&A session at the end. Thank you very much. So over to Yanis now to introduce our fourth talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we talked about diplomatic initiatives, and we talked about the relation of diplomatic initiatives, probably also going beyond liberal feminism. And I think that's something Miriam might want to talk about as well. Her piece is entitled "The African Union Silencing the Guns Between Stereotyping and Owning Gender Rules." And Miriam Mona Mukalazi is a German-Ugandan PhD researcher studying peace and security studies. During her PhD, she conducted research at the Institute for Women, Peace and Security at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., as well as the Institute for Peace and Security Studies at Addis Ababa University. Miriam has worked for UN Women in Germany, the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy, as well as the World Bank Group. At the moment, Miriam works as a research consultant for the EU Commission, analyzing the Team Europe initiative. Here you go, Miriam.
Thank you so much, Yanis. Just a quick question. How many people will be speaking after me? So I know how I have to shorten my talk.
One and a half, kind of two, because it's one paper, but two people.
Okay, then I will try to shorten.
I don't think you should shorten your remarks. we can run late if necessary.
Okay,
But
thank you.
don't cut too much because it's very important as well. So yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. Before I start, I also want to say thank you to everyone here, especially also navigating, the whole research process to the pandemic, which I think was also like a special condition we had, and I really appreciated that you brought us like still together during that time. I will talk a little bit briefly about who I am, where also like I'm coming from with my research, also what has motivated me to write that piece. Of course, I will talk briefly about what did I do in that article and briefly talk about the results. And what is really important for me today is to talk also about the takeaways. How can we also transfer the research findings I had for this research to other fields? So I'm Miriam, and I'm based in Cologne, Germany, but also in Florence, Italy. I've already started a postdoc at the European University Institute. So if you're in Florence, please feel free to reach out to me. And I'm really interested to see how regional organizations and regional security organizations, particularly, navigate the gender lens. And how that again feeds into the more global level when we talk about gender, peace, and security. So I would say I've started my career with 1325, so that has really been the red thread through my whole research as well. And why I was motivated to look at the African Union, in particular on the so-called campaign. Now it's more like a policy framework, silencing the guns, is because my research before was like comparing the African Union and the European Union and how they actually legitimize their ways of doing WPS. So I was thinking, okay, let's look at the African Union Silence in the Guns campaign, because there you can definitely also see how the African Union as an institution really thinks about gender and disarmament and gender and peace building, because it says really prominently in the roadmap of Silence in the Guns that the aim is to make the whole continent a conflict-free continent, which I think is a really big objective, also looking at the history of us people. So I'm not sure whether there has ever been like a conflict-free continent, but let's see. And so what I did, I was looking in particular not only at the institutional documents, but also at photos, for example, how the African Union actually embeds gender stereotypes and how they also navigate around them and own them and emphasize them, and actually also by the end put like a hyper visibility, what I call a hyper visibility on these gender roles. For example, there's an emphasis on the regional characteristics of the African women. So we have the slogan for at the African Union, African solutions for African problems. So the logical argument is then, okay, also like African solutions, African problems, and we have African women finding those solutions. But we also have this hyper visibility when we look at the photos, for example, where you have actually like panel talks about how gender is being integrated into this campaign. And then you have only men talking about it, but in the back you have like posters with always the same woman being portrayed there as a soldier. So you have the hyper visibility in the back, but you have the hyper visibility of men actually talking and producing the knowledge on that topic. So I find this really interesting. And for me, of course, coming back or having this background of like always comparing the African Union with the European Union, especially on gender issues, because both on paper, but also globally, are strong actors of WPS in general. So I was really curious also to look what is actually the African Union doing differently, and not necessarily better, but just doing differently. And there it was really interesting to see that the African Union, when it comes to gender stereotypes, and in particular like stereotyping women, they include the diversity of women when it comes to religion, ethnicity, how they also talk about ethnic conflicts and so on, what kind of role women play there. And there definitely you can see a huge difference with the European Union, who has just like introduced recently the concept of diversity and intersectionality, and is also really wake about what this actually means when we talk about disarmament and conflict resolution. Here you can definitely see like, another approach of the African Union. And what also was really like stunning, that although the African Union puts an emphasis on the African characteristics, which by the way, they do not really define in the documents, and you can see also when it comes to stereotypes that these stereotypes, you can never talk about them isolated, like from history, because we live in a globalized world. So you can see sometimes in the documents you have clearly like neoliberal, Eurocentric definitions of how women are more peaceful in conflicts, and that's why they are needed. Or when we talk about also motherhood, the role of mothers in post-conflict societies, you can sometimes see a clear neoliberal way of thinking, but then you can also see how they are hybrid ones, and they're interconnected. And I think this is also really crucial to understand that although there's a divide, and I think we should also name that, between the global north and the global south, we are still somehow interconnected, and you cannot clearly point, especially when it comes to regional organizations and in these institutions, you can't really point always out the clear differences with how you can see that these stereotypes have been fed into the institutions. But then, of course, the broader aspect or picture of my research was to ask the question also, how do we as scholars define also stereotypes, and then go further, how do we define which stereotypes are harmful, which are not, which are acceptable? I mentioned the stereotype of women being more peaceful, so they should be engaged more in disarmament. And I think this is a good example of a stereotype where many people then think, okay, but it's a good stereotype because it's not really harmful. And so I was just asking myself, okay, who's actually telling us that this is like an okayish stereotype? And then, of course, then looking at the broader spectrum of that, we can see still in scholarship, but also within the institution itself, mostly the stereotypes that have been coming from a Eurocentric view are quite dominant, and also then are the ones that are being tackled. But then if we have like stereotypes that are more regionalized and more linked to the continent, there's more they're not being treated in the same way. And I think that's what I'm trying to say, also asking like us as scholars, why do we take certain knowledge about gender roles as set, and why do we define others as we can negotiate them? And I would like to end with the takeaways, looking also at the times we are now in. I think we can see that also, not, for example, just for the African Union, but also in other parts of the world, when we always have this repetition of women and girls and babies, and then we have other genders being neglected, or other, for example, than men, in particular, Muslim men at the moment being portrayed as like as dangerous, as a threat. And I think, although you could argue these are just words, we can see how these words actually enter security institutions and then translate into actually policy actions. I think that's why I'm also so interested in institutions and security institutions, how they embed gender stereotypes, because you can see how institutions can change over time because they've been fed by different information coming through people. And they can change actually for us feminists into a positive way, where we can see, institutions can adapt a feminist way, a feminist understanding of security. But it also has to be clear for us that institutions can also instrumentalize these stereotypes, or even, I would say, even worse, institutions could go into an anti-feminist direction. So we shouldn't take this for granted, that either there's the status quo or there will be like a feminist perfect institution. No, actually, it could get even worse. So I think I would start here. And again, thank you so much for all your contributions. I really enjoyed reading them.
Thank you so much, Miriam, for the fascinating talk, covering a lot, I think. Yeah, we are running late, so I ask you to answer a question that I have brought, because I don't see anyone having a question in the Q&A. I have to ask you to be a bit brief, but I want to ask nevertheless. So my question would be, how may this stereotyping that you sketched out relate with a liberal feminism in diplomatic spaces that Maritza and Luisa have criticized before? So how does that tie together?
So your question is what kind of stereotypes I found in my research as neoliberal, or?
Yeah, or how is that probably is that supporting itself, this idea of liberal feminism, just supporting women coming into positions, or is that related, or is that something else entirely?
Yeah, no, it's definitely related, because you can see, like, when I looked more at the language of like post-conflict societies, then there was many times the narrative that if women are being economically empowered, then this would contribute to a more wealthy post-conflict society. And again, I'm not saying like this is bad or this is good, but it just shows that there's a really strong neoliberal influence in a regional framework, right? That also prides itself with being African. And then the question is again, okay, how would then, like, for example, the African equivalent look like? But that's not even being a question asked. So I think this is the most concrete example I can use for a brief answer.
Very interesting. So much.
Yeah, yes, I agree, Yanis. Thank you very much. I'm taking over again. In order to introduce the presentation for our fifth and final paper of today, as Yanis mentioned, we're overrunning a bit, but we want to make sure that everybody has enough space to give the talks they need. We'll understand if attendees need to leave, but the full recording will be up on the Scrap website. So our final talk for today is from Shireen Jurdi and Nancy Ehrenberg-Peters. Shireen is the Middle East and North Africa Regional Liaison Officer at the Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflict. Like all of our speakers today, she draws on an enormous wealth of experience and expertise, particularly aimed at localizing global agendas of the sorts of things that we've been hearing about, women, peace and security agenda being one of them. Nance, as we've heard, is a Beirut-based research analyst and writer. She was a master's student at SOAS and has an undergraduate degree from Edinburgh, and is fluent in Spanish and Arabic as well as English. Thank you very much, pair of you.
Thank you so much, Henrietta. I want to thank everybody. I was inspired today, and while reading the issue, I want to thank ZeFKo, SOAS. I want to thank Scrap for this amazing project, because I think it's the way that we need to have it as a way forward for us who work on this linkages between small arms, light weapon, and gender-based violence to have the space. I want to add also, Danielle at the very beginning was mentioning wealth. So I am also part of wealth. And this is where also our activism started with, let's move the money from the war to make peace. And this is where, like in 2008, when I was running the elections at the International Board of Wealth to represent MENA, I was fascinated with our African sisters singing this, just as I am fascinated also with silencing the guns as at the regional level. Coming from Lebanon, coming from MENA, I have lived all my life in conflict. And unfortunately, conflict has been normalized in our lives. And it's time for us in these spaces and in other spaces to really acknowledge and for us to understand, no, we do not want to normalize having weapons in our daily life. We do not want to normalize conflicts. And this is something that can start with the culture, and with the culture, not only a culture of peace, but also of a culture that knows exactly how to pinpoint what is leading to this conflict and the root causes of conflict. I want to also to say, Daniel also was mentioning the Summit of the Future. We're having also discussions as dialogue. Also, the Secretary General is calling for gender equality. I think Maritza is familiar with the agenda that the Secretary General is putting forward. We're having regional consultation, and I'm proud to be leading also on the pre-dialogue in MENA. And definitely I want to add the part of where are women in terms of discussions that has to do with disarmament once we talk about gender equality. Now, to come back to me, I have, as I've said, I've lived in conflict. I know what it is to run under the table and how to find shelter, but I had to find my way on how to make the linkages between gender-based violence and small arms light weapon when it was not there. Why? Because most of the work that is being done is setting things in silos. We are not putting the agendas, women, peace, and security, within like connecting the dots, and other agendas is just silencing all these agendas, silencing also projects that go here and there. I was very happy that I received a small fund as being a member of Wolf Lebanon from a Wolf to have a small project on small arms light weapon. It was during COVID. And at that time, I decided like, yeah, let's do some kind of a research where we can at least try to link important issues, move away from silos. So in 2019, at the time when we got the fund, it was the Lebanese government just endorsed the National Action Plan on the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And the Lebanese government just became joined as the 102 second state as a state party to the Arms Trade Treaty. So I tried to build on these two agendas and to see how can I link it to our present day life, and how can I link it also to gender-based violence organizations. And I found that there are lots of gaps in the discussion, lots of gaps in how we can link that, and how also the gender-based violence organizations are dealing with issues of small arms light weapon. So the National Action Plan in Lebanon had the small arms light weapon as one of the indicators of the conflict prevention second strategic objective that it had. In terms of the Arms Trade Treaty, we have also the implications of gender-based violence as per the Article 7.4. But how, these are not linked. And also civil society was not part of the processes of the implementation process of this particular indicator. Unfortunately, most of the work and the discussion on small arms light weapon is either normalized in terms of practices or politicized in the sense that it's not time to talk about a small arms light weapon, putting it within the general national security. But once we're talking about small arms light weapon, it means we're talking about our personal security, about an indicator and a pillar of the human security, and it's not about national security. So to make a long story short, we did the survey. We included indicators from the Arms Trade Treaty, including permits, how it is to have a permit, how is it to file a case against being impacted by or threatened by small arms light weapon. And even gender-based violence organizations, they do not do the training on all this gender-based violence, and they do not link it to small arms light weapon. The same goes with the security forces. So once they trained on this, they do not link it. A third point that I also noticed, that even these organizations that monitor and document women being killed, they do not mention and label that women are killed by small arms light weapon. So as if it is a huge taboo mentioning that weapons and the implications that it has on gender-based violence. So it was a 3-month project. Just imagine a 3-month project that was able to find its way to the journal. And here I want to thank Nancy. We had initial discussions with our colleague from Iraq. We were supposed to do, so maybe we can have later on some further also research on gender-based violence and women, peace and security in MENA. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to continue, and there where I reached out to Nancy. Nancy, we need to continue. We need to be part of this issue. Have this pilot document that is going to be in the shelves. Can we make it public? And we started to do this amazing work. Now I will have Nancy, please tell us about the main findings, outcomes, and methodology. Thank you, Nancy.
Thank you, Shireen. Yes, I'll keep it quite brief. Also because Shireen really skillfully touched on the main themes that appear in our paper titled Untold Stories, Exploring the Link Between the Illicit Proliferation and Possession of Weapons and Gender-Based Violence in Lebanon. So as Shireen was speaking about, our paper really focuses on how the impact of small arms and light weapons on the community, on human security and the individual level is a highly underestimated, misunderstood and unspoken topic actually in Lebanon and the MENA region more widely. This is both true at the societal level and the political level. And as Shireen also mentioned, it's usually thought about and talked about through a national security lens. It remains a very sensitive topic. And even more sensitive, just to add to the topic of weapons, is the issue of advancing women's rights and achieving a degree of gender equality. So these challenges also fed into our research and problematized some of the research methodology and our scope of the work. But nonetheless, we saw that this was such an important topic to speak about, because we do not claim that this is an all-encompassing piece of research, but rather it's really intended to get the conversation going, to spark the conversation on this debate. Because there's so little out there. There's so little out there written about this, and also just in wider discussions. And so, you know, what I found quite remarkable when starting this research is discovering just how prominent and prevalent small arms and light weapons are in Lebanon. So according to a 2017 small arms survey, Lebanon ranked 9th in the world for the highest rate of civilian firearms holdings. In 2017, this was the latest data, 9th in the world. And so our paper looks at the reasons behind this in one of the sections, and it discovers that there are different categories of weapons, such as the legacy weapons, which are inherited or left over from the Lebanese Civil War in 1975 to 1990. And one of our esteemed interviewees, Fadi Abi Alam, told us that whilst medium and heavy weapons were seized by the Lebanese government after the Civil War, small arms and light weapons were not. So they remain in circulation in the country with no governance or regulation on their use or possession or trade in these weapons. Other reasons, and I won't go through everything, but other reasons include, obviously, since 2019, with what the World Bank has coined the worst economic crisis that the Lebanese country has ever faced. This has also put immense pressure on society, immense pressure on the survival of society, and also has contributed to further eroding the Lebanese state, so therefore further decimating the Lebanese government's capability, will, and ability to govern small arms and light weapons. And this goes alongside the rise in political instability in the country and in the region, across Lebanon's borders, and so on. So that's all interesting, and we give quite a lot of context in the paper about the rise in the proliferation and possession of small arms and light weapons in Lebanon. And another core element of the paper analyzes, from a different angle, actually, factors which contribute to perpetuating this problem in Lebanon, which is looking at the failure of legal provisions and instruments, namely the Arms Trade Treaty that Lebanon is party to, and also discriminative legislation, namely the Lebanese Personal Status Law and the Domestic Violence Law, and how they're failing to prevent and govern the illicit proliferation and possession of weapons. If I just give one example, even though many examples are provided in our paper, so the Personal Status Law in Lebanon actively and explicitly discriminates against women in terms of their rights to divorce and custody of their children. Now, our interviews as part of this research with pro-women or GBV Lebanese associations or NGOs, and also the results of this survey with women victims of GBV, highlighted that the personal status law and these particular provisions really majorly contribute to why women in Lebanon are fearful about speaking out about the GBV that they've encountered, or also interlinked or perhaps separately, the illicit possession of a weapon, perhaps unlicensed weapon, that their perpetrator has, out of fear of facing these societal repercussions that Miriam and Maritza and Eloisa were talking about as well, talking about how women are, face societal repercussions in terms of fearing of shame and tarnishing their reputation in the community. All of these things we talk about in the paper and are very real and contributing to really elevating this problem. And interlinked, therefore, we also speak about the patriarchy in Lebanese society, because, of course, the legal provisions and things that happen at the macro level are both reinforced and the cause of societal oppression against women. So I won't go into too much detail about our empirical data and the results from the survey, even though that is in the paper. But just finally, some policy responses that we identified from this research. Firstly, an integrated legal system must be formulated between the Lebanese internal security forces and civil society to protect women and establish an accessible reporting process for the women victims of GBV. Secondly, Lebanese civil society must put pressure on religious communities and parliamentarians to amend the personal status law. And thirdly, advocating for recognition and acceptance that the proliferation and possession of small arms and light weapons has a gendered element to it. It's not solely a question of national security. We need to humanize it and localize it. Thank you, Shireen. I think Shireen just wants to wrap up.
Thank you, Nancy, for all the points that you mentioned. Lastly, I want to say, just as this paper saw the light with ZeFKo and with the scrap, also this paper's recommendation is going also to continue. We're going to have a project with Peace Women across the globe, an organization based in Bern, which my colleague here in attendance, Heidi from Germany, from Wolf Germany, was able to put me in contact with. And we're going to work on the recommendations that we have. And hence, we're going to raise more awareness and to tell about like the GBV and the connections with the small arms light weapon to civil society and to the security forces, as well to parliamentarians. And we're going also to come up with an amended law for the gunfire arms in Lebanon. The last amendment was in 1959. So just imagine with the work that we need to do, in addition to creating a grassroots organization based on a youth network from students from universities who are able also to make these linkages and to put forward the knowledge that we have in terms of small arms light weapon and humanizing, depoliticizing, and saying that we have the right to life, we have the right to live, and we have the right to live away from fear. Thank you.
Wow, thank you both. I mean, that's really incredibly exciting to hear that you're going to be able to follow through and act on your recommendations, and I'll follow that closely. Now, as we've mentioned a couple of times, we are running very much over time. So I'm kind of going to fold your question into, we were going to invite people to have some final reflections generally, and so you're going to kick off your final reflections. I think that you presented a really, really important piece of work, demonstrating the conditions combining technologies and cultural and legal frameworks that are resulting in people being killed, people dying. And so I think this really is a important way to round off the collection, actually, to remind ourselves that what we're dealing with is lives and risk and danger, and it's impacting people all the time around the world. So my final invitations to all of you are to kind of think about, it feels as though an emerging theme for running through all the special issue is really thinking about untold stories about risks and dangers and how people conceptualize danger and risk more generally, and the untold aspects of the linkages between different dangers, and also untold stories in terms of what works, what we can do to solve things, how we can conceptualize things differently. As it's been pointed out, there are stories about how we can do things differently. There are examples of things that work, but they maybe don't get the prominence that other things, the other more conventionally told understandings have. So as I said, I'm going to invite everybody to reflect on this, starting with going in reverse order. And Dr. Constantine, I want to point out there was actually a question for you in the chat, in the Q&A function. I was looking in the chat, and the question is inviting you to reflect on whether the narratives that you identified could help promote disarmament. So that's just to give you the heads up. And so maybe that could be part of your final reflections. So thank you very much. Shireen and Nance, could you give us your final reflections, please?
Yeah,
And
thank
sorry
you.
to rush you,
Maybe
but if you could be quick.
no, no worries. No, that was an amazing session. Everybody, we learned from each other. I think we need to go back to the manufacturing of these small arms light weapon, and we need to hold these companies accountable, complicit. Maybe this is one of the things, and raising awareness. Trying also to work on the sustainability of such projects. I mean, out of nothing, because we're not dealing about projects, we're talking about lives of people. And this is when we talk about small arms light weapon and weapons in general. We were talking here about different kinds of conventional and non-conventional weapons. And the most important thing as a third point is how we as civil society and we as people who are aware of these agendas, how we raise our voices, what platforms are we able to use, and how also we amplify our voices together. What is the way to push our struggles to go beyond borders and beyond continents? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Nance, would you like to add to that?
No, it's okay. I echo it. Yeah, we can move on.
Oh, thank you. Miriam, final reflections from you, please.
I think also what this special issue really shows, there's already so much knowledge out there. I mean, also looking at the transnational feminist movement or movements, there's already so much knowledge out there. So I think it's not about actually like inventing things new or finding new solutions. They are already out there. It's just also for us, especially and for scholars also, to ask curious questions. Why do we have still dominant narratives that are so persistent, and other narratives and other solutions that are actually being othered and not being talked about or putting to the sideline? And I think this is really crucial, because then we also understand, okay, we are in these security dilemmas, we are in these threats, and we are surrounded by death because there is a dominant narrative that is being upholded and not being questioned enough, that actually leads to insecurities. I think that's what I want to point out.
Thank you. Very important. Yes. Eloisa, do you have any
Yes.
final reflections? Yeah.
Yes,
you.
I would like to say that a very important point is to spread awareness that conflicts are a highly gender activity. And I think in debates about peace building, there has not been enough reflection on the question why arms proliferation mostly affects women and girls and marginalized communities. So it's very important to connect the issue of disarmament with the problem of patriarchy and weapons possession. So it's important to make this type of interlinkages to have a wider picture, and to understand again that women and girls and different types of marginalized communities are differently affected by conflicts. So I think it's very important to move forward this project of feminist leadership in disarmament, reflecting on these issues. And I really would like to thank everyone here for starting these ideas and starting off this project, and all the contributors to this special issue. And I really hope that we can continue also collaborating in the future, because it's really been a privilege to be here with you all, with these distinguished scholars, and it's really good and very promising. So thank you all.
Thank you, Eloisa, and thank you for all of Scrap's work making this possible. Yes. Ambassador Chan, Ambassador Chan, what are your
yes, no worries.
Thanks.
First, we need to address the issue of masculinities. We started discussing masculinities in the third review conference of the counterterrorism strategy. We failed, but we started the conversation, and it's crucial. We also started talking about masculinities in the BMS 8. Now that I'm the president designate of RepCon 4 on small arms and light weapons, I want to encourage you to present summaries of your papers as papers for the conference. this conversation about gender and proliferation of weapons and silencing the guns will be crucial for delegations to bridge the divide between academia and practitioners. So please, I will welcome your papers. We have time until the 31st of January to present, make a summary of them and send them to the ODA conventional weapons. Your email, you have my email, so please present those papers. And final point is that we really need to continue this conversation. I think that the paper that Eloisa and I presented is just one step in making those interlinkages between what is happening in academia and what's happening in the UN. And the work that Unity has been doing in highlighting the underrepresentation of women in disarmament fora is crucial, because only 1/3 of women are participating. The highest number is in cyber. And it's not only who is the delegates, but it's who also is delivering that statement. Sometimes the men deliver a statement that was written by a woman. And we need to, my final call is, it has to be intentional. We need to work intentionally to bridge that divide. We need to work intentionally. I do it by only, having female interns or having female, I say that they don't work for me, they work with me. I intentionally make sure that the women who are doing their PhDs or studying are involved in high politics, because if we don't do it by design, you don't know how to navigate these waters, and it's crucial to learn how to play this game. So my call for you is keep going. Your work will have resonance, and let's make sure that we're more visible and occupy more space. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm sure I'm not alone in having scribbled down that date and that invitation. Thank you for that. Dr. Eashley, have you got any final reflections for us, please?
Just very briefly, I'm aware that, we have a couple of papers in the special issue on nuclear politics and nuclear disarmament, and the other papers are dealing with other kinds of weaponry and other kinds of disarmament. Often those two fields are treated very separately. It occurs to me that the framework that the activists I discuss in my case study elaborate around nuclear colonialism offers a way to bridge them, because if you think about nuclear risk and danger, to refer back to your question, Henrietta, that's often thought about in Western disarmament circles as avoiding the ultimate catastrophe. But when we think about nuclear colonialism, what happens is we reframe danger and risk as actually already with us. So it's not a future possibility. Nuclear harms, nuclear dangers, nuclear risks are happening in the here and now, have been happening for decades, have been a lived experience for many, have shaped and distorted lives, communities, ecosystems across the planet. So I think this is perhaps a useful lesson we can take from the case study. It's also a framework that's been used more widely in the nuclear humanities, and it's something that might help us to think about how nuclear weapons aren't, as been argued, aren't this kind of uniquely fetishized weapon that we need to treat kind of separately and have separate kind of disarmament mechanisms, but instead it's part of a spectrum of violence. And we need to make the links with other weaponries and other forms of nuclear technologies and other kinds of disarmament struggles.
You need to know when you put back the food.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. It just makes me want to talk more and more to all of you, I have to say, but I'm closing myself down and giving the final word before Yanis wraps up to Dr. Considine. Thank you.
Yeah, just to link the question I got in the chat to your question, the idea of the male genius narrative, what it contributes to is an idea that nuclear issues are too complicated for most people. That you need some sort of technical or specialist knowledge to understand them, and that they're for a kind of elite, and that they're somehow secret. And none of this is true. And so combating this is an important part of opening up what forms of expertise are listened to, what forms of issues are part of the conversation, and who gets to speak about this. And I think that's incredibly important.
I agree. And I think it's a really brilliant message to come out of this set of people, this set of talks and this set of papers. Thank you all very much. Really enjoyed all of your presentations. I will now hand over to my colleague, Yanis, to draw this all to a close. Thank you, Yanis.
Thank you so much. Tough job to find some closing remarks to round this all up, because as this project itself, this conversation today has also been a long journey. And just to remind you, and probably to recap as well, this project started as a students' project in the pandemic in 2020, 2021. In these tough years when we were sitting in small apartments in London, and with a webinar series. And when I started at Scrap Weapons, when I came to London, I never thought our work would blossom into this magnificent conversation on panels, on paper now, right? I'm really excited to this soon, to the day that will be there soon, of holding the special issue in my hands in its physical form. So this will be great, amazing achievement. After the first webinar series, we applied for this ZeFKo special issue. We thought that the knowledge we witnessed in the conversations on the panels, in the webinars, and the people we gathered deserved and needed to be further institutionalized, and that a journal special issue seemed a suitable way to go. And well, what did we achieve? I think Miriam and Henrietta summed it up well when they said that we brought knowledge to the foreground. Most of the achievements, of course, in that regard, are achievements by the authors, talking about the nuclear beginning and the construction of the male genius, as Laura did, thinking about nuclear stories that have not been widely heard, as Catherine did, thinking about how the DPNW promotes marginalized groups, but also struggles to include wording going beyond liberal feminism in diplomatic spaces, as Maritza and Eloisa did, putting a hyper visibility on gender roles, and using stereotypes, but also nuancing stereotypes. Talking about all of that and asking how do scholars define harmful or acceptable stereotypes, as Miriam did, or connecting illicit weapons proliferation and gender-based violence, as Sreen and Nancy did, and not even mentioning those that can't be here today. We put a lot of knowledge into the foreground, I think, and for that, I would all like to thank you. I would like to thank and congratulate the authors for this magnificent achievement. Congratulate ZeFKo for this magnificent achievement, and last but not least, my co-editors at Scrap as well. Thank you all for coming to today's session. Keep an eye on the ZeFKo website, because coincidentally, during the session, our editorial, which was the last piece to be released, has been released on the ZeFKo website on Springer. It was actually right during this session. So very exciting that everything is out. It's only a matter of time until the webpage also shows this as a fourth issue. Congratulations to everyone and Scrap, and thank you all. See you soon.
Thank you. See you soon. Bye-bye.
See you.
See you.
Bye.